40 years of marriage to a judge taught me to spot a predator, but I never expected to find one in my own son. Norman didn't just lock me in the basement, he tried to strip away my very soul. He took my glasses, my hearing aids, and filled the air with the scent of chemicals to make me doubt my sanity. As the heavy bunker door sealed me in the muddy dark, I realized my child was devouring my life. But Norman made a fatal mistake. He forgot his father's obsession with our home security. Listen to the end to hear how I handled it, and subscribe to hear more of my journey. The rain doesn't knock on windows in Atlanta. It doesn't tap or patter. It hammers, a relentless, rhythmic assault against glass, as though the sky itself is trying to break in. I stood at the study safe with my thumb pressed to the biometric panel, listening to that sound and thinking, as I always do when the autumn storms come, of the night the judge died. The house has never been quite warm since. I heard Norman before I saw him. The soft, loafer-shod shuffle of a man who has never learned to walk with intention, followed by the faint, nauseous sweetness of whatever he'd been drinking. He appeared in the periphery of my vision like a smear of rumpled expensive fabric, and I made the mistake, the single, consequential mistake, of not turning around fast enough. The safe door caught my thumb with a sickening crack. I did not scream. 40 years of being a federal judge's wife taught me that a sharp intake of breath is more dignified than a howl, and I have always been, above all else, dignified. The sound I made was small and controlled, nothing more than a single punctuation mark of pain. But the pain itself was not small. It was a white-hot needle lancing from the joint of my thumb straight up the meridian of my arm, and the world briefly strobed white at the edges. The watch was inside. I could hear it, that steady, precise ticking of the Patek Philippe, my husband's gold watch, the one I'd set in the safe this morning to have the crystal polished. Its rhythm was mocking now, counterpoint to the frantic thud behind my own sternum. Norman's fingers, soft, damp, trembling with that nervous sweat that always beads at his temples and never seems to dry, pressed harder against the metal. Not looking at me. Looking past me, the way he always did when he was working himself up to something. Norman. My voice was even. Judicial. Release the door. He didn't. He reached into his rumpled jacket with his free hand, moving with the slow, theatrical deliberation of a man who has rehearsed this scene many times in the mirror. And he produced the bear. Buddy. God help me. The thing was a ruin, a one-eyed, stuffing leaking atrocity of matted brown fur that smelled, even from arm's length, of mothballs and old attic dust and something darker underneath, something musty and particular that I have always associated with the worst of Norman's episodes. He'd had it since he was 4 years old. The judge used to call it his security blanket with a personality disorder. I had never found that funny. Tonight, watching Norman perch the grotesque object atop the high-security safe with the reverence of a priest placing a chalice on an altar, I found it even less amusing. The court is in session, Mother, Norman whispered. His voice had pitched upward into that register, that manic, childlike modulation that lives somewhere in the back of my throat as a Pavlovian trigger for dread. His eyes were wide and unblinking, fixed on Buddy with an expression of tender, deranged sincerity. Buddy is the only judge in this house now. He patted the bear's lopsided head, the gesture trembling and intimate. He's seen the ledger. He knows you've been withholding his inheritance. I kept my face neutral. I am very good at neutral. Behind my eyes, I was cataloging. The slur-free speech meant he was sober, or close enough to it. The prepared theatricality, the bear produced on cue, the rehearsed line, meant this wasn't impulse. This was architecture. Norman had planned something, and he'd been planning it for long enough to give it structure. That was more frightening than anything else. My thumb throbbed inside the pin safe door. I breathed through it. The cream-colored legal envelope was on the desk blotter, where I'd left it an hour ago when I'd been reviewing its contents for what I privately acknowledged might be the last time. The shadow will. The document that encoded the Walker Justice Initiative, that directed the estate's assets toward the foundation the judge and I had spent 3 years architecting together. The document that, if executed, would leave Norman precisely what the judge had decided he deserved, a generous but finite trust and not 1 square inch of leverage over the estate's legacy. Norman snatched it with a bird-like jerk of his hand. The paper tore slightly in his haste. He clutched it to his chest immediately, both arms wrapped around it like a child with a stolen toy, his face contorting into a mask of greedy triumph so unguarded it was almost pitiable. Almost. I tried to wrench my thumb free. The pain was extraordinary, a tearing, grinding sensation that I categorized and set aside with the discipline of long practice. I am 68 years old and I have survived 3 kidney stones, a car accident on I-75 that broke 2 ribs, and the night my husband stopped breathing beside me in our bed. My thumb would survive Norman. But he leaned into the safe door, settling his full, soft weight against the steel, and the pain spiked sharp enough to make my vision swim. That's mine, Norman. Still even. That document belongs to the estate. He smiled at me. It was the smile of a man who believes, for the first time in a very long time, that he has won. You've been looking a bit gray lately, Martha. The vial came from his other pocket, small, glass, a clinical screw top that he flicked open with 1 practiced thumb. I had perhaps a quarter of a second to register what was happening before his hand clamped over my mouth and the vial went under my nose. The smell hit like a physical blow. Sulfur, dense and eggy. Beneath that, something putrid, biological, the unmistakable signature of organic decay. And underneath that, a chemical sharpness that my mind couldn't place in the moment, lost as it was in the primal, lizard brain panic that wrought triggers in every living creature. The stench filled my sinuses, coated my throat, saturated the back of my palate. My eyes watered instantly. That's the smell of your liver failing, Norman said. His breath was hot against my cheek, his voice dropping into a parody of medical solemnity. The doctor said it would start with the olfactory hallucinations. Do you smell the death inside you? I choked. The caustic fumes burned my throat, and for a single, terrifying heartbeat, I am not ashamed to admit this, not to myself, I wondered if he was right. The smell was so visceral, so pervasive, so convincingly wrong, that my rational mind momentarily lost its footing. I saw spots at the edges of my vision. My stomach lurched. Olfactory hallucinations. Liver failure. The smell of your own dying body. Norman watched me with a predator's patience, his expression cycling through pity and malice with the fluid ease of a man who has practiced the combination. He twisted the vial, and the liquid spilled onto my silk collar, soaking in immediately, binding the stench to the fabric, to my skin. See? You're confused, he cooed. You're losing your grip on reality. The spots pulsed. The rain hammered. Buddy stared down from atop the safe with his single glass eye. I forced myself to breathe slowly, deliberately, in through the nose, categorizing, not reacting, and that is when I first caught it, beneath the rot, beneath the sulfur, a synthetic top note. Something sharp and almost clean. But I couldn't hold the thought. Not yet. The panic was still too loud. He released the safe door. My thumb screamed as blood rushed back into the joint, but I had no time to register it, because his hands were already at my face. The glasses came first. He wrenched them from my nose with a practiced efficiency that spoke of rehearsal, and 1 gold-rimmed stem snapped with a brittle, precise crack that I felt as much as heard. The world blurred instantly. The study dissolved into impressionist smears, the dark mass of the desk, the lighter rectangle of the window, the pale oval of Norman's face, featureless now, unreadable. Then the hearing aids. He plucked them from my ears with the same efficient cruelty, and the world didn't just blur, it receded. The rain became a suggestion. His voice became an underwater murmur. The ticking of the watch inside the safe vanished entirely. I am 68 years old. I require corrective lenses for anything within arm's reach and precise audio amplification to parse speech in ambient noise. In 3 seconds, my son had stripped away both. I stood in my own study, in my own house, a ghost in the room I had occupied for 31 years, and I felt something I have not felt since the night the judge died. Small. I pressed my lips together and said nothing. Norman's grip on my upper arm was bruising through the cashmere, the grip of a man who has spent his whole life pretending to be softer than he is. He hauled me toward the door with a lurching urgency, and my measured, silent gait, the gait I developed over years of navigating the estate in careful, intentional steps, became a stumbling, undignified shuffle. I tried to count paces. 1, 2, 3. He jerked me sideways, breaking my rhythm deliberately. I understood then that he knew. He knew about the counting. He'd been watching me longer and more carefully than I had been watching him, and he had thought to account for it. We passed the portrait of the judge. I couldn't see it clearly, just the dark mass of the frame, the pale vertical of the face, but I knew it was there. I have walked past that painting 10,000 times. The judge at 45, painted the year he was elevated to the federal bench, his expression composed and formidable in the way that used to make first-year lawyers rehearse their arguments in the bathroom mirror. His painted eyes stared through us, through the blur, a silent witness to what his house had become. Norman was breathing heavily now, a wet, ragged sound that was the only thing I could clearly hear, the only thing that cut through the underwater hum. It was the breathing of a man who is frightened of what he's doing and doing it anyway, which is, in my experience, the most dangerous kind. The mahogany paneling gave way to cold industrial steel, and a curtain of tapestry fabric swept my face as Norman kicked the hidden door open. The temperature dropped 10 degrees in an instant. The air changed, from the cedar and old leather scent of the study to something stagnant and mineral, concrete dust and the lingering, oily chemical residue of what he'd spilled on my collar. The basement stairs. I reached for the railing on instinct, my fingers grazing cold wood, and for a moment I almost had it, almost had the anchor, the count, the spatial certainty. But Norman kept pushing, his hand flat between my shoulder blades, forcing me down the steep descent at a pace my knees couldn't properly absorb. Each step sent a jarring impact radiating up through the joints. I gripped the railing harder, slowing myself through resistance, because the alternative was falling, and I will not fall in my own home. 17 steps. I counted them through the pain and the blur and the underwater hum, and I reached the bottom with the number firm in my mind. 17. Remember 17. He flung me forward, and I hit the concrete floor hard. The impact traveled through my hip, my shoulder, my elbow, redistributing itself across the older architecture of my body with a thoroughness that left me breathless. I rolled onto my side, trained instinct, the same motion that had kept my ribs intact on I-75 20 years ago, and lay there for a moment with my cheek pressed against the grit of the bunker floor, the cold seeping through my blouse. Breathe. Don't give him the sound. Behind me, the heavy steel door groaned on its hinges. Norman's voice came through it, muffled, stripped of most of its tonal information by both the soundproofing and the missing hearing aids, but loud enough to parse. Rest now, mother. The judge needs time to deliberate on your sanity. The door slammed shut. The boom traveled through the floorboards, through the concrete, through the bones of the house, and into my bones, and then there was nothing. Silence. Not the silence of a quiet room, not the silence of late night or early morning. This silence was a different order of magnitude, a thick, velvet weight that pressed against my eardrums from the inside, the specific, total sensory negation of a soundproof vault. No rain. No wind. No traffic from Peachtree Road. No ticking clocks. I had spent 31 years in this house and I had never heard it sound like nothing. I sat up slowly, one hand planted on the floor, methodical. Concrete texture under my palm, rough, cool, the fine grit of poured aggregate. I assessed systematically, the way the judge had taught me, injuries first, environment second, options third. The hip would bruise impressively, but nothing had cracked. I know what cracked ribs feel like, and this was not that. The shoulder ached. The thumb was swollen and throbbing, movement limited but present. My eyes were watering from the chemical exposure and my throat burned faintly. I was intact. Without my glasses, the darkness wasn't just an absence of light. It was a barrier, a physical thing, my near-field vision reduced to vague shapes and textures. I pressed my palms flat against the floor and breathed, orienting myself in the way I had been taught. This is concrete. This is the bunker. I know this room. I have been in this room 100 times. I am not buried. I am simply in a room I know with the lights off. I patted down my pockets with deliberate, methodical hands. Empty. Both of them. Norman had been thorough in the ways he'd thought to be thorough. No phone, I'd left it on the study desk. No keys. No pen, which he'd apparently noticed in my breast pocket and removed when I hadn't. He had prepared for the obvious things. He had forgotten my left wrist. My right hand found it, the smooth, cold crystal of the watch face, the intricate gold links of the band. The Patek Philippe. I never take it off. Not for sleep, not for showers, not for anything. It has been on my wrist continuously since the morning of the judge's funeral, when I clasped it there and said, silently, I'll carry this. Norman, in his focus on the safe and the envelope and the theatrical production of the vial, had forgotten that the watch I'd placed in the safe this morning was the spare, the one I'd set aside for cleaning. The real watch. His father's watch. It was on my wrist. I traced the crystal with my thumb, slowly, a single circuit, and felt the small, steady vibration of the movement inside. Still running. Of course it was still running. A Patek Philippe doesn't stop because the lights go out. Neither do I. I sat in the dark and I made myself do it. I brought the contaminated collar of my blouse to my nose and I inhaled, deliberately, analytically, the way a sommelier tastes a wine they suspect is corked. Not reacting. Assessing. The rot was still there, heavy and synthetic, coating the back of my throat. Sulfur, dominant. The fatty, putrid signature of simulated organic decay. But I was looking for the infrastructure now, the scaffolding beneath the performance, and without the shock of the first exposure, without the panic, I could find it. There. A sharp, almost clean top note, cutting through the sulfur like a blade through velvet. Isopropyl alcohol, unmistakably. And beneath that, something else, a dimethyl sulfide signature, the specific, industrial marker of a lab-synthesized compound rather than a biological one. I know this because the judge presided over an environmental fraud case in 2009 that turned on the distinction between naturally occurring hydrogen sulfide and its synthetic analogs, and I spent 6 weeks reading the expert testimony while he prepared his notes. It was a stage prop. The realization arrived not as relief but as something colder and more clarifying, the specific quality of mind that comes when emotion steps aside and analysis takes over. Norman hadn't lost control. He hadn't snapped under the pressure of his debts and his failures and the long, corroding weight of his inadequacy. He had planned this. He had sourced a compound, he had prepared a vial, he had rehearsed lines and positions and the practiced efficiency with which he'd removed my glasses and my hearing aids. This was architecture. And the architect had forgotten one fundamental thing: I helped design this house. I closed my eyes, redundant in the dark, but the gesture itself clarifying, and I touched the watch face once, a single thumbstroke along the cold crystal. 40 years, my love, I thought. He thinks he's locked me in the dark. He's forgotten you taught me to live there. I rise from the concrete slowly, measuring the motion, hip first, then hand to floor, then the long unfold of spine and knee that my body performs these days with more complaint than it used to. The ache is deep and dry, the kind that lives in the cartilage rather than the muscle, the kind that reminds you that 68 is not 48 no matter how disciplined the mind that runs the machinery. I do not reach for the walls. I don't need to. I begin to pace. Not in the frantic, wall-to-wall way of a caged animal, but in the measured, deliberate 4-inch increments the judge taught me in the second year of the cartel threats, when we decided, together, that the estate might one day need to be navigated by a woman with no light and no time. Slide. Step. Slide. Step. Each foot placement is a data point, a verification against the architectural map I carry behind my sternum like a second skeleton. 12 by 14. This bunker is exactly 12 by 14 feet of poured concrete, with a drainage grade that inclines approximately 2 degrees toward the center. I feel it now in the subtle shift of my weight, the way my heels want to drift inward. The steel door is behind me, 6 feet. The ventilation shaft is upper right, northeast corner, 20 feet. The alcove under the stairs, the one the judge built during what he called his productive paranoia phase, is 22 paces north-northeast from the landing. I know this room the way I know my own hands. I am not a prisoner in a void. I am a coordinate on a grid I've known for 30 years, and that is an entirely different thing. The rod on my collar kept trying to pull me back. That is the insidious genius of what Norman had done, not the physical confinement, not even the darkness, but the smell. It clung to my silk blouse with the tenacity of something organic, something that belonged to the body, and every breath I took tried to reinforce his narrative. Decay, decline, the smell of your own failing liver, you are already rotting from the inside. The olfactory system is the oldest sense, the one most directly wired into the limbic structures, the one least subject to rational override. He had chosen his weapon well. I counteracted it with the only iron I had left. Tomorrow, I whispered, my voice raspy from the caustic fumes but finding its register quickly, and tomorrow, and tomorrow. The Macbeth soliloquy. I punctuated each line with a sharp tap of my heel against the concrete, a metronome, a physical anchor, and I let the words fill the velvet silence of the bunker with something that belonged to me and not to Norman. Creeps in this petty pace from day to day, to the last syllable of recorded time. The rhythm of the verse is not accidental. I chose it deliberately, the way a surgeon chooses an instrument. Macbeth's soliloquy on meaninglessness is, paradoxically, one of the most ordered pieces of language in the English canon, its nihilism delivered in perfect iambic pentameter, its despair structured with mathematical precision. Reciting it requires the simultaneous engagement of memory, rhythm, breath control, and vocal production. It is the cognitive equivalent of a full-body stretch, activating every neural pathway Norman's gaslighting was trying to flatten. Out, out, brief candle. Life's but a walking shadow, a poor player that struts and frets his hour upon the stage. By the time I reached signifying nothing, my heartbeat had slowed to a cold, judicial tempo. The rot was still in my nostrils. I was still in the dark. My thumbs still throbbed and my hips still ached, and my son had stolen my glasses and my hearing aids and my husband's envelope and locked me in the basement of my own home. And I was still here. Intact. Thinking. I am still here. The intercom detonated. There is no other word for it. A violent burst of static tore through the absolute silence of the bunker like a fist through paper, and then, before I could even orient toward the sound, the voice arrived. My husband's voice. You let him down, Martha. You let our son rot. I stopped moving. I stopped breathing for one involuntary second, my body responding to the sound before my mind could intervene, because the body doesn't know about digital editing or frequency manipulation or the fact that the judge has been dead for 14 months. The body only knows that the voice it loved for 40 years is suddenly filling the air around it, and something in the chest reaches toward that voice the way a plant reaches toward light. Then my mind caught up. The words were wrong. The judge never said those words, not in that combination, not in that order, not with that particular accusatory pitch. He spoke to me in 40 years about Norman's failures perhaps a dozen times, always quietly, always with the careful precision of a man who chose his words the way he chose his verdicts, not from anger, but from the exhausted, clear-eyed assessment of evidence. He never bellowed. Not at me. Not about our son. This was a Frankenstein construction. Old recordings, spliced and distorted, stitched together into a phantom designed to wear my husband's voice like a mask. The accusations bounced off the concrete walls: unfit, failure, you abandoned him, each one arriving with the timing of a staged performance, calibrated to maximize impact. Norman was trying to weaponize my grief. He was trying to turn the memory of the man I loved into a phantom executioner, using the judge's own voice to deliver a verdict the judge would never have rendered. The cold in my chest hardened into something crystalline. I didn't cover my ears. I moved toward the wall, pressing my cheek flat against the cold, vibrating concrete, and I did what the judge taught me to do with a witness he suspected of fabrication. I stopped listening to the content and started listening to the physics. The voice was hollow. I registered it immediately, lacking the rich, resonant bass of my husband's actual presence, the quality that used to fill a courtroom and make the air in the gallery feel denser, more formal. This was a digital approximation, a shadow of the waveform. When the judge spoke, you felt it in your sternum. What was coming through that intercom touched nothing below my eardrums. I listened for artifacts. The slight click of a playhead between spliced segments, there, between unfit and your failures are a stain. The compressed, slightly muffled quality of a file that had been encoded at a suboptimal bit rate, the telltale flatness of audio that has been processed more than once. The faint, rhythmic hiss of a digital file with inadequate noise reduction. My husband didn't just teach me how to read a courtroom. He taught me how to listen to evidence. I spent 40 years learning to distinguish between testimony and performance, between truth and a well-constructed representation of truth. This was performance. This was a recording played through a machine, and when you stripped away the emotional payload, when you refused to let grief cloud the analysis, it was a remarkably imperfect one. I am still listening, Norman. And I hear you. Then I found it. Beneath the looping accusations, beneath the emotional scaffolding of my husband's stolen voice, there was a sound that didn't belong to the performance at all. A steady, high-frequency hum, 60 Hz, the specific drone of older digital hardware on continuous power draw, the sound that fluorescent lights and aging server banks both produce, the frequency that lives just below conscious awareness in most people. Not in mine. My mind mapped it instantly to the equipment closet behind the study, upper floor, the northeast corner of the main hall. The old archival server. We'd bought it in 2009 for the transcript digitization project. The judge wanted 30 years of his case notes converted to searchable digital format, and I had spent 4 months working with the contractor to configure the system, learning the software architecture in the process because I don't permit systems in my house that I don't understand. Norman, in his laziness, in the particular, expensive laziness of a man who has never had to maintain anything himself, hadn't updated the hardware. He was running this entire psychological production through a 15-year-old server I had personally configured, on a network I had helped design, through an intercom system I had watched being installed in 2007. He was staging his theater in my house, using my equipment, and he thought I wouldn't recognize the hum of my own machinery. The Phantom had a power source. And power sources can be found. The recording cut. The silence that followed was different from the silence before, charged, anticipatory, the silence of a held breath. And then my son's voice, unedited, came through the speaker, wet, slightly slurred, the consonants of a man who had been drinking the Macallan he knew he wasn't supposed to touch. Hear that, Mother? Even Dad knows you're unfit. I said nothing. The intercom didn't require my response for Norman to keep talking. He was performing for himself as much as for me, the way he always had. Bradley Vance is coming in 72 hours. A pause. I heard him exhale, a long, self-satisfied breath. He's already drafted the conservatorship papers. For a $2.5 million management fee, he's going to help me put you in a place where the air always smells like this. $2.5 million. I filed the number with the cold precision I reserve for figures that will eventually be used against their source. "You'll be comfortable," Norman continued, and there was something almost tender in his voice now, the tenderness of a man who has already spent the money in his head and is now managing his guilt with euphemism. "They'll take good care of you. You won't have to worry about the estate anymore." The call ended. 72 hours. 3 days before Bradley Vance arrived with his papers and his pen and his $2.5 million management fee, and I would be legally erased, my signature invalid, my testimony inadmissible, my autonomy dissolved by a court order that would define me as incompetent to manage my own affairs. A non-person in a facility that smelled like manufactured rot, while my son bled the Walker estate into his creditors' pockets and buried everything the judge had built. I touched the watch face once. 72 hours is sufficient, I thought. I've built cases in less. I moved to the upper northeast corner of the room, navigating by the 4-inch increment walk I'd been refining since my first circuit. The wall was cold galvanized steel here, the surface texture changing from painted concrete to the ridged metal of the ventilation duct housing, and I found it with my fingertips like a blind woman reading a familiar page. The duct was a narrow rectangular slit, far too small for anything resembling a body, but that wasn't why I was interested in it. I pressed my palm flat against the grill and felt the faint, stale draft of the mansion's central HVAC system, the breath of the house moving sluggishly through its internal passages. This shaft connected the basement to the library, past the study, and ultimately to the master suite, a continuous metal channel running through the house's interior like a spinal cord. Sound travels through metal with extraordinary efficiency. The judge had noted it once, during one of his productive paranoia periods. "If someone ever puts you somewhere quiet, find the metal, Martha. The house will carry your voice if you give it a conductor." But I needed more than a scream. A scream was noise. Noise could be explained, dismissed, drowned out by a man with a recording and a story about a mentally deteriorating widow. I needed a signal, something specific, something that would only be recognized by someone who knew what to listen for. That required the right ears above me. I didn't have those ears yet. But I was beginning to understand what I would need to do to find them. I closed my eyes. It is a reflex without function in absolute darkness, but the gesture carries its own logic. It signals to the body that we are moving inward now, into the architecture of the mind rather than the architecture of the room. I let the floor plan rise behind my eyelids with the clarity of long practice. The judge had turned the blind navigation into a game during the worst of the cartel years, when the threats against him had become specific enough that the FBI assigned a detail and we began living with the quiet assumption that any night could become a crisis night. He would blindfold me in the study and I would have to reach the kitchen, the back door, the safe room in the basement, this room, navigating entirely by count and air pressure and the subtle, specific sounds of each room's acoustic signature. I had been furious about it, initially. I am a woman who prefers information to darkness, who functions best when she can see the board. But the judge had been patient, the way he was patient with everything he considered necessary, and eventually I had understood that what he was teaching me wasn't just navigation. He was teaching me that the house existed whether I could see it or not. That my knowledge of it was not contingent on my eyes. That I carried the map, and the map was more reliable than any flashlight. 22 steps. From the basement landing, 22 steps north-northeast to the alcove under the stairs. I moved through the dark, my hand trailing an inch from the wall without touching it, sensing the change in air pressure as the space narrowed, the slight temperature differential as I moved away from the ventilation shaft, the acoustic change as the ceiling lowered above me in the alcove's shallow throat. 1, 2, 5, 10, 15. The count was steady. My breathing was steady. The rod on my collar was still there, and I let it be there, noting it without permitting it to mean anything. 20. 21. 22. I stopped. My fingers found the wall in the dark, smooth painted drywall, featureless to the eye but not to the touch. I pressed my palms flat and moved them slowly, millimeter by millimeter, searching for the imperfection the judge had been so pleased with himself about, a hair-thin seam, set flush to the surface, invisible unless you knew exactly where to look and exactly what texture to feel for. My nail caught it. A tiny, spring-loaded latch, recessed a quarter-inch into the seam, the size of a thumbnail. I pressed it with steady, even pressure, not too hard, which would bypass the spring mechanism, but with the precise, medium force the system required, and the section of wall gave with a muffled, satisfying thud. The smell came first, ozone and dry plastic and the specific, clean metallic scent of electronics in a sealed space. Then the air, cooler and drier than the bunker's ambient chill. My hand moved into the alcove and found the surface immediately. Glass-like, cool, slightly textured, not a screen, nothing that required visual input. The backup interface. The smart home, tactile panel the judge had installed in 2015 during what he'd called his belt and suspenders phase, designed for emergency lockdown operation and for use by anyone who couldn't rely on visual displays. It used haptic pins. A grid of raised, pressure-sensitive points that shifted and reconfigured under your fingers like braille, communicating system status through touch rather than sight. I had learned it because the judge had asked me to, and because I had decided, as I decided about most things the judge asked, that if it was worth doing it was worth doing fluently. I pressed my fingertips to the grid and felt the pins respond, a ripple of tiny recalibrations beneath my touch, the system waking from dormancy, and then the steady, granular information of the house assembling itself under my hands. Front door, locked. Gate, closed. Kitchen lights, on. Study lights, on. Server room, active. Master suite, unoccupied. Kitchen, occupied. I was no longer blind. I was plugged directly into the mansion's nervous system, reading its vital signs with my fingertips, and the house, my house, 31 years of my life, was reporting back. Above me, the floorboards spoke. The vibration came through the ceiling in a pattern I could feel through the tactile panel's housing and through my feet against the concrete, a frantic, heavy-footed pacing that I recognized immediately. Norman, in the kitchen, directly overhead. His gait was uneven, his rhythm the erratic stop and start of a man whose thinking has outpaced his self-control. He was spiraling. I could map it from the floor, 3 steps northeast, pause. 2 steps back. A long pause, that was him at the counter, gripping something, the Macallan most likely. Then the pacing resumed, faster this time, more compressed, the steps of a man whose plans have just developed a fault line. He had opened the envelope. Of course he had, the first thing, the moment he was back upstairs, ripping into that cream-colored legal paper with the gleeful urgency of someone who has waited too long for something he believes is already his. And he had found the shell. The envelope contained exactly what it appeared to contain, the preliminary correspondence of the Walker Justice Initiative, the founding documents, the charitable mission statement. Legitimate papers, professionally prepared, completely devoid of the activation protocol for the shadow will. Norman had stolen a decoy with the confidence of a man who had never once been deliberately outmaneuvered by his own mother. The pacing overhead intensified. A cabinet slammed, the kitchen cabinet over the sink. I could identify it by the specific acoustic quality of the impact, a sound I'd been hearing for 30 years. Something fell. He had the shell. I had the pearl. The silence of the bunker, which he had designed as my torture, was beginning to haunt him more than it haunted me. I stood at the tactile panel and let the full architecture of the situation assemble itself with the clarity I reserve for moments when emotional noise would be a liability. The Shadow Will's activation protocol was a 20-digit alphanumeric sequence. I had memorized it the day the judge created it, 4 years ago, in the same methodical way I memorize everything that matters, written out by hand 12 times, then destroyed, then recited daily for a month until it lived in the muscle memory of my mind rather than on any surface Norman could find. I could enter it right now, in the dark, with my fingers on this panel. but the system required two-factor authentication. My voice print was the first factor, a 6-word confirmation phrase I could provide anywhere, anytime. The second factor was a physical authorization key held on the estate's primary server upstairs, a rolling cryptographic token that changed every 24 hours and could only be verified by the server itself. I was the brain. The key was upstairs. I had the will. I had the code. I had the panel. What I did not have was the server access, and the server was in the equipment closet behind the study, in the room where Norman was currently pacing himself into a full psychological unraveling. I needed to get out of this room, or I needed to bring Norman back into it. I ran my fingertips over the haptic grid one more time, feeling the pins shift and settle, the house breathing its information into my hands. The server was active. The network was live. The old archival system was humming on its 60 Hz frequency in the closet upstairs, running Norman's Ghost Theater through hardware I had personally configured. Hardware I knew better than he did. I touched the watch face in the dark, a single, deliberate circuit of the crystal. He thinks he's locked me in his trap, I thought. He's forgotten I built the house that contains it. 72 hours was sufficient. I had survived 40 years beside a man who prepared for every contingency because he understood, with the bone-deep certainty of someone who had put dangerous people away, that the worst-case scenario is not hypothetical. It was not hypothetical now. And I was not hypothetical either. I began to think about how to bring my son back into the dark. The chime reached me through the bones of the house. 2 long, sonorous tones, the front door, the formal entrance, the one we reserved for people who mattered. I felt it more than heard it, a vibration traveling through the foundation and the walls and the steel of the ventilation duct I already had my ear pressed against. I had been listening to the 60 Hz server hum and Norman's overhead pacing for what felt like hours, cataloging the rhythms of the house above me, and then the chime cut through everything else and I stopped breathing entirely. Norman? It's Elliot. I came as soon as I got your message. The voice was slightly flattened by the ductwork, stripped of some of its warmth, but I would have known it at a fraction of the volume. Mr. Elliot, James Elliot, the judge's most devoted protégé, the man who had clerked for him at 25 and never entirely left his orbit, who still called him, sir, in his private thoughts, I was certain of it. The man who had sat in our kitchen at midnight during the cartel years, reading case files and drinking terrible coffee and asking the judge questions about law and justice and the distinction between the two with the intensity of someone who understood that the answers actually mattered. He was 30 feet above my head. My heart did something it hadn't done since the bunker door slammed, it leaped. Elliot is the one person Norman cannot charm with a checkbook. He views the law with the same religious fervor as the judge did, not as a system to be navigated or leveraged or monetized, but as a moral architecture, a structure built to bear the weight of truth. If he is here, if he sees me, if he understands what is happening in this house. I did not waste breath on a scream. Not yet. I reached up and found the button at the collar of my cardigan, the third button, silver, 3/4 of an inch across, and I pulled. The threads snapped like tiny bones, one by one, a sound so small in the dark that it felt enormous, and the button came free in my fingers. I thrust my arm into the narrow mouth of the ventilation duct, angling my wrist to press the button flat against the galvanized steel of the interior wall, and I began to scrape. Scrape, scrape, scrape. Pause. Scrape, scrape, scrape. Pause. Scrape, scrape, scrape. 3 short. 3 long. 3 short. The oldest signal in the world, traveling through the metal skeleton of the house's HVAC system, moving at the speed of conducted vibration through steel toward the library vents, toward the foyer, toward the rooms where James Elliot was standing and listening in. I pressed harder, angling the button to maximize contact, feeling the edge of the metal bite into the skin of my knuckle. The sound was small but metallic and rhythmic and deliberate, and Elliot was a careful man, an observant man, trained to listen to things that didn't quite fit the ambient pattern of a room. Hear it, I thought, scraping steadily. Hear the rat in the walls, James. The judge's wife. Listen. Norman's voice floated down through the duct, and even filtered through metal and distance and HVAC insulation. I could hear the performance in it. The particular, deliberate quality of a voice that has selected its emotional register in advance. Oh, Elliot, thank God you're here. A watery tremor. Carefully calibrated volume, not theatrical enough to seem performed, not quiet enough to seem genuinely overwhelmed. I know this register because I have been watching Norman modulate his emotions for 42 years, since he was an infant learning which cries produced which responses, and he has never gotten more sophisticated than this, the selection of an appropriate mask from a finite wardrobe. It's been a nightmare, he continued. She snapped after the funeral. I found her in the bathroom with the judge's old razor. She's convinced the house is bugged, that the walls are rotting. I had to call in private specialists. I kept scraping. 3 short. 3 long. 3 short. The razor. The judge's straight razor that I kept on the bathroom shelf because I could not bring myself to move it, because it still smelled faintly of his shaving soap, because some objects are too saturated with a person's presence to be put in boxes. Norman had noted it. He had noted everything, the watch, the razor, the habits of grief, and he had catalogued them all as raw material for a future narrative. Private specialists. That would be the men who had installed whatever medical paperwork Bradley Vance had prepared. The clinical vocabulary of a well-resourced conspiracy. I scraped harder. Elliot. The scream came up from somewhere below my ribcage, the kind of volume that costs something, that leaves the throat feeling abraded and raw. I cupped both hands around the duct opening to funnel the sound, trying to direct it upward through the metal shaft, force it past the soundproofing and the insulation and the distance. The HVAC blower kicked on. The timing was almost cosmically cruel. A low-frequency roar filled the shaft from below, a mechanical hurricane that rushed up through the ductwork and obliterated everything in its path, my voice, the button scraping, any signal I had managed to generate in the preceding minutes. The sound filled the bunker like a physical presence, pressing against my eardrums, and I kept screaming anyway because there was nothing else to do, screaming into the hurricane until my throat felt like it had been lined with broken glass and my voice was coming out in a ragged, thinning thread that I could barely hear myself. I stopped. The blower ran for 45 seconds and then cycled down. Silence returned, absolute and indifferent. I stood with my hands still cupped around the vent opening and I breathed through the pain in my throat and I waited. Suicide? Elliot's voice, when it came back down the duct, was sharp with genuine shock. Martha? She was always the strongest of us. Yes, I thought, with a fierceness that surprised me. Yes. Tell him that. I heard the rustle of paper, the specific, professional rustle of documents being transferred from one set of hands to another. Norman presenting the forged medical reports. Bradley Vance's work, or someone Bradley had hired, because the paperwork would need to be credible enough to withstand a cursory examination by a man who had spent 20 years working in federal court. The dementia is aggressive, Elliot. Norman's voice had shifted registers, from shattered son to reluctant expert, a man who has had to educate himself on a painful subject for the sake of a parent he loves. She's in the North Wing now, under heavy sedation. The doctors say any visitors would trigger a paranoid episode. A pause calibrated for sorrowful wait. She thinks everyone is an assassin. Even me. Especially you. The precision of it was almost admirable. Especially you. In one sentence, Norman had transformed Elliot from a potential rescuer into a perceived threat, turned my most trusted ally into evidence of my deterioration, made the very act of his concern into a reason to keep him away from me. He had thought about this. He had thought about Elliot specifically, anticipated him as a variable, and prepared the countermeasure in advance. I pressed my lips together and said nothing, because there was nothing to say into the metal shaft, and because the HVAC blower might kick on again at any moment, and because I was beginning to understand, with a cold and sickening clarity, how good my son had gotten at this. The silence that followed Elliot's reading of the documents lasted long enough that I began to count the seconds. 12. 13. 20. 25. Push back, I thought. Ask to see her. Insist. You know me, James. You sat at my table for 15 years. You know what my mind looks like when it's working. Ask to see me. I see, Elliot said. 2 words. Freighted with a defeat so complete I felt it travel through the ductwork like a cold front, a change in atmospheric pressure, the specific emotional quality of a strong person arriving at a conclusion they didn't want to reach. The judge always feared her mind was too sharp for its own good. A pause. If the doctors say she's a danger to herself, then she's in the best possible place. God, Norman. I'm so sorry. The weight of his belief arrived not as sound but as physics, as a change in the density of the air around me, as something I could feel in my chest in the specific location where Hope had been living for the last several minutes. James Elliot, the judge's most trusted student, the man who had dedicated his professional life to the principle that truth is findable if you look carefully enough, had looked at Norman's paperwork and found it sufficient. I was truly dead to the world above. The front doors closing echoed through the vents with the finality of a gavel strike. Not a slam. A careful, respectful closing, the sound of a man who has just been told there is a sedated woman in the north wing who must not be disturbed, and who is honoring that instruction with the considerate gravity of someone who believes it. Elliot. Precise, principled, honorable Elliot, walking away from the Walker estate with a forged file folder under his arm and a weight of genuine sorrow in his chest, and not a single suspicion that he had just walked away from the woman he came to check on. The silver button slipped from my fingers. I heard it strike the concrete, a small, precise, metallic sound, and I did not reach for it. I slid down the wall until I was sitting on the floor again, my back against the cold drywall, and I stayed there for a long moment with my hands in my lap and my eyes open in the dark. The isolation had changed quality. It was no longer just the physical fact of a locked room and stripped senses and manufactured darkness. It had become something more complete, a condition of the world, a state in which the people who would have helped me had been made into evidence against me. My champion had come and accepted my erasure with a sorrow that was entirely genuine, which made it, in some ways, worse than contempt. At least contempt implies continued engagement. I am a ghost haunting a house that has already moved on. The cold concrete seeped into my bones. I let it. The intercom crackled. Did you hear that, Mother? The best possible place. The crying was gone. Whatever emotional register Norman had been performing for Elliot had been set aside the moment the door closed, packed back into its storage with the efficiency of a man who was never feeling it in the first place. What replaced it was sharper, uglier, a jagged laugh that started as satisfaction and broke into a cough, the sound of a man who has had too much of the Macallan and not enough sleep and is experiencing the specific, volatile euphoria of someone who believes they are winning. Even your golden boy thinks you're a vegetable. I heard the clink of ice against glass. He was at the kitchen counter, directly overhead, his weight producing the familiar creak of the floorboard 3 feet from the refrigerator. I heard your little scratching in the vent. He was almost cheerful about it, the way a large cat is cheerful about a small mouse's attempts at escape. It sounded like a rat. That's all you are now, Mother. A rat in the foundations of my house. I said nothing. I was listening past his voice to the quality underneath it, the cadence, the diction, the specific looseness of a man whose inhibitions are traveling in one direction while his mouth is traveling in another. He was further gone than I had estimated. Good. Then he stopped talking to me. The shift was subtle but immediately recognizable, a change in projection, a slight softening of the consonants, the specific tonal register Norman has always reserved for the bear. I have heard him talk to Buddy since he was 4 years old. I know the voice. What do you think, Buddy? Should we wait for the papers? Bradley is late. The storm is slowing him down. His voice had dropped to a conspiratorial whisper, the sound of a man in conference with his own damaged psychology, and what lived in that whisper was something beyond strategy or calculation. It was the sound of a man who has completely lost the thread of reality and is holding the frayed end with both hands, using a child's toy as a stand-in for the internal coherence he can no longer generate himself. Maybe we don't need a sanitarium. A pause. I pressed my ear against the duct and did not breathe. Maybe a peaceful sleep is kinder. A few extra milligrams of the red ones. The red ones. I knew the medication he meant, digoxin, the cardiac glycoside the judge had been prescribed for the atrial fibrillation that developed in his final years, the medication that requires precise dosing because the therapeutic window is narrow and the consequences of excess are swift and severe. Just like the judge, Norman murmured, and his voice had taken on a quality I had never heard in it before, something almost reverential, the tenderness of a man recalling an accomplishment he is privately proud of. He didn't suffer, did he, buddy? He just stopped. The air in the bunker felt thin. I sat very still on the concrete floor and I let the words arrive in their full weight, and I felt something I have not permitted myself to feel since the morning I woke beside my husband and understood from the quality of the silence that I was alone in a new way. Just like the judge. The judge had been on digoxin for 3 years. His cardiologist was meticulous, his dosages consistent, his monitoring regular. His death had been sudden, an arrhythmia in the night, swift and silent, the kind of cardiac event that happens in elderly patients on cardiac medication and is documented and grieved and filed away as a tragedy of age. I had grieved it that way. I had allowed myself to grieve it that way for 14 months, because it was the shape grief came in, and I am not a woman who manufactures alternative narratives when the documented one is sufficient. Norman kept talking to the bear. Just a little swap, he murmured, almost fondly. Sugar pills in the prescription bottle, and the real ones in the trash. He died looking at me, buddy. He knew. But he couldn't say a word. A soft sound, not quite a laugh, not quite a sob. Just like her. The prescription bottle. The refill Norman had offered to pick up in March. You don't need to drive, Mother, I'll handle it, I'm going that direction anyway. The small, unremarkable act of filial consideration that I had registered as a hopeful sign of maturity and filed away as a pleasant surprise. The gesture of a son finally, at 42, beginning to behave like a son. He had driven to the pharmacy. He had driven somewhere else. And 14 months ago, in the early hours of a Thursday morning, my husband's heart had stopped while Norman Walker stood in the room and watched it happen and did nothing, because there was nothing to do, because he had already done it. He had murdered the judge for a legacy he'd already spent. The despair burned away. I am not a melodramatic woman. I do not use the word burn loosely. But that is the only accurate description of what happened in my chest in the 30 seconds after Norman finished his confession to a one-eyed stuffed bear. The grief I had been carrying for 14 months, the weight of it, the complicated, layered ache of losing the man who was the axis of my adult life, simply incinerated. Not dissolved, not faded. Gone, replaced by something that runs at a different temperature entirely. The manufactured rot on my collar wasn't my liver. It wasn't chemical decay. It was the moral putrefaction of the boy I had raised, the specific, nauseous stench of a person who has performed an act so fundamentally wrong that it has contaminated everything around him, including the air. I had spent decades protecting Norman from his own failures, the failed Ivy League career, the bankrupted ventures, the string of people he had charmed and disappointed and discarded. I had extended mercy I did not always believe was warranted because he was my son and because I had told myself that loyalty is the highest form of love and that abandoning him would be an abandonment of something in myself that I was not prepared to relinquish. He had repaid that mercy with a slow-motion execution of the man I loved. The grief was gone. What replaced it was singular and cold and extraordinarily clear, judicial purpose. Norman Walker had committed a crime. He had committed multiple crimes. He was upstairs right now, consulting a stuffed bear about the logistics of committing another one. And I was the widow of a federal judge, in the basement of a house I knew better than he did, with my fingers 30 feet from a tactile panel that could bring everything he had built crashing down around him. He did not deserve a sanitarium. He deserved a verdict. The gravel drive announced Bradley Vance before he reached the door. I heard it through the foundation, the particular, wet crunch of car tires on the stone aggregate, a sound I know by the density of it, the way each stone yields slightly under weight and then resettles. A heavier vehicle than Norman's, moving at the deliberate pace of a man who considers himself an important arrival. Bradley Vance. The attorney. $2.5 million in conservatorship management fees, and a briefcase full of papers that, once signed, would reduce me to a legal nonentity, strip my signature of validity, transfer my autonomy to my son's name and my son's decisions, and make everything Norman had done and was planning to do not only possible but difficult to challenge. The signature papers were upstairs. Norman was spiraling, fueled by scotch and the ghost of his father and the deranged confidence of a man who has just watched his last obstacle walk out the front door with a forged file folder. Bradley was arriving with finality, with the procedural conclusion of a plan that had been months in the preparation. I did not slump. I sank, deliberately, purposefully, back to the floor, dropping to my knees in the dark and crossing the short distance to the alcove on memory and count alone. My fingers found the recessed panel. The haptic pins rippled under my touch, reporting the house's status in their precise, tactile language. Server, active. Network, live. All systems nominal. The time for scratching at ventilation ducts was finished. The time for screaming and hoping and waiting for Elliot to ask the right questions was finished. I was done performing the role of a woman hoping to be rescued, because rescue, it turned out, was not arriving from outside. I am the widow of a federal judge who was murdered by his son in his own bed. I am a woman who has spent 40 years learning the architecture of power and patience and the precise moment at which restraint becomes complicity. I am 68 years old, I am alone in a basement in the dark, and I have 17 steps to the door, 22 to the alcove, and a 20-digit activation code memorized in the muscle memory of my mind. I pressed my fingertips to the haptic grid and felt the house wake under my hands. The final court was about to convene. The light was the first violence. When the bunker door shrieked open on its hinges, the harsh artificial light from the corridor beyond hit my unshielded eyes like a physical blow. After hours in absolute darkness, the optic nerves receive even ordinary illumination as an assault, and I had no glasses to mediate the shock. I turned my face slightly, blinking against the burn, and forced my eyes to adapt through will rather than comfort, because I needed to see what was coming through that door and I needed to see it immediately. Norman stood silhouetted in the frame, swaying with the particular, loose-jointed quality of a man who has been drinking since mid-afternoon and is now operating somewhere in the metabolic territory between bold and reckless. Buddy was tucked under his left arm, pressed against his ribs with the instinctive, protective grip of a child clutching something irreplaceable, and his right hand hung at his side, empty, the fingers moving slightly in the way fingers do when their owner is trying to project a steadiness he doesn't feel. Behind him, Bradley Vance. I had never met Bradley Vance in person, but I knew the type with the specificity of a woman who spent 40 years watching her husband assess people from the bench. The suit was impeccable, charcoal wool, hand-finished, the kind of garment that announces its cost without specifying it. The posture was practiced authority, shoulders squared, chin level, the body language of a man who has learned to use physical presence as a professional instrument. The leather-bound folder under his arm held the conservatorship papers. The fountain pen in his hand was uncapped. He looked at me the way people look at things they intend to use. "Sign the papers, Martha," he said. The voice was a smooth, oily baritone, calibrated, I thought, for exactly this kind of transaction, for the rooms of people who were frightened or confused or too old to push back effectively. "Do it for the boy. Do it so we can get you the help you need." They stepped through the door together, into my cage, and the contempt in that movement, the ease of it, the absolute confidence of two men walking into a room they believe contains an animal, clarified everything I needed to know about timing. They thought I was the animal. I did not wait for them to reach me. I did not perform confusion or weakness or the shuffling disorientation of a woman who has been in the dark for hours, though all of those things had their basis in fact and would have been entirely convincing. I did not give Bradley Vance the visual narrative he had come to collect. I moved. Not at Bradley. His folder and his pen were instruments, not threats, and instruments could be dealt with later. Not at Norman's face, though there was a part of me, the part that had spent the last several hours breathing manufactured rot and listening to my son confess his father's murder to a stuffed toy, that wanted to address his face with some directness. I moved at the bear. 3 steps, fast and low, the wiry strength of a woman who has been doing nothing for hours but mapping this floor and feeding her own fury. My fingers hooked into the matted, moth-eaten fur of Buddy's left side, the fraying side, the one where the stitching had been giving way for years, and I wrenched. Norman's grip on the bear was the grip of instinct, not intention, and instinct, in a man who is drunk and off balance and has not genuinely anticipated resistance, is not sufficient. The bear came free. Norman let out a sound I had never heard from him in 42 years, a high-pitched, strangled yelp, unperformed and unmediated, the sound of a child having his world stolen without warning. I retreated into the shadows of the alcove in 4 steps, pressing my back against the wall, and I clutched the bear to my chest with one hand and reached behind me with the other. My fingers found the tactile panel's edge. Not yet. But I needed to know it was there. Stay back. My voice came out the way the judge's voice used to fill a courtroom, not loud, but with a density that occupied the available space entirely and left no room for competing sound. The acoustics of the soundproof bunker gave it an additional quality, a contained resonance that bounced off the concrete walls and arrived from multiple directions simultaneously. Both men stopped. I held Buddy at chest height, and with my right hand I found the clasp of the Patek Philippe, the gold butterfly clasp, heavy and precise, with a deployment mechanism that ends in a small but sharply defined edge of machined metal. I pressed that edge against the bear's throat, right at the frayed seam of the neck, the place where the stitching had been slowly surrendering for years. I'll tear him open, Norman. My voice was even. Judicial. I'll rip the stuffing out of your only friend and scatter it on this cold floor. Norman's hands came up in front of him, both hands, palms out, the universal gesture of a person who wants something to stop. His face had gone pale in the harsh corridor light, glistening with the nervous sweat that never seemed to dry on him, his wide brown eyes fixed on the bear with an expression I can only describe as existential terror. Not fear of injury. Not fear of legal consequence. The specific, foundational terror of a man watching the last external structure of his psychological architecture being threatened with dissolution. Buddy was not a comfort object. Buddy was the container Norman kept his functional self in. Without Buddy, there was nothing to consult, nothing to perform normalcy for, nothing that accepted the version of himself he'd been unable to abandon since childhood. The absurdity of the threat was its power. I was holding a stuffed animal against the edge of a watch clasp in a soundproof basement and threatening a 42-year-old man with its destruction, and it was working, because the man in front of me was not 42 years old in any way that mattered. Bradley Vance looked between us with the expression of a man who has walked into a room and discovered that the species ratio is not what he was briefed. You want to play the judge, Norman? I said. Then the court requires a testimony. I shook the bear slightly, a deliberate, controlled motion, just enough to make the fraying stitching at the neck shift visibly. Norman made a sound in his throat. Bradley took a half step toward the door, recalculating something. Tell Buddy the truth, I commanded. Tell him what you did to the real judge. Tell him what was in the prescription bottle. The silence that followed lasted perhaps 4 seconds. Norman's eyes were locked on the bear's single remaining button eye with the focused intensity of a man trying to find an anchor in a room that has begun to tilt. His breathing had gone short and wet, the rhythm of someone whose chest has tightened past comfortable expansion. The pressure of his crimes, the weight of 14 months of carried secret, the confession he'd already made once tonight to an audience he'd believed was safely contained, was meeting the vacuum of his cowardice, and the collision was visible on his face like weather. His knees buckled first. I had to. The wail came from somewhere below language, a guttural, unstructured sound that rose into words only gradually, the way a person surfaces from deep water. Norman dropped to the concrete floor, and the sound he made going down was the sound of a man whose legs have simply stopped participating in the project of remaining upright. The collectors, they were going to break my legs, Mother. Dad wouldn't give me the money. He called me a leech. The word landed with particular weight, and I understood that he had been carrying it for years, that it had been the original wound that everything else had grown from. So I swapped them. The red pills for the sugar ones. I just wanted him to sleep, I just wanted it to be over. Bradley Vance had gone the color of old chalk. I watched him register what he had just heard, not as a man processing grief or shock, but as a man performing a rapid legal triage of his own exposure. He had come here as a co-conspirator in a conservatorship fraud, which was criminal but manageable, the kind of thing that could be navigated with the right counsel and a sufficiently aggressive defense. He had not come here to stand in a room while his client confessed, in front of a witness, to first-degree murder. He took a step backward toward the door. I let him take it. The locks were coming. I needed another 30 seconds. My left hand was already behind my back, my fingers on the haptic grid, and while Norman wailed his confession into the soundproof air and Bradley processed his own undoing, I was working. The 20-digit sequence lives in my muscle memory the way the Macbeth soliloquy lives in my voice, not recalled, but executed, the body performing what the mind encoded years ago through patient repetition. A 7-4-9X. My fingertips moved across the raised pins with the practiced lightness of a woman playing an instrument she has rehearsed in the dark. Each correct entry returned a tiny haptic pulse, a single vibration through the fingertip, a confirmation from the house that it recognized the code, that it was accepting the authority I was asserting. I felt them come, 1, 2, 5, 10, 12. The system was waking beneath my hands in stages, like a large animal returning to consciousness, its protocols rewriting themselves from the basement upward. Norman's admin locks were dissolving. The estate systems were transferring their allegiance with the quiet efficiency of well-designed software recognizing a higher authorization level. The house wasn't his anymore. The house had never been his. Digit 18. 19. 20. The intercom didn't hiss. It screamed. Every screen in the mansion ignited simultaneously. I knew it from the quality of the light that changed in the corridor beyond the bunker door, from the faint reflected glow that caught the edges of the stairwell, from the way Bradley Vance's face shifted upward and his expression changed from calculated retreat to something considerably less composed. The smart glass partitions in the study, the library, the media room, every display surface in the Walker estate was now broadcasting a single feed, the high-definition security camera in the basement bunker, the one the judge had installed in 2015 as part of the same belt and suspenders initiative that had produced the tactile panel. The camera Norman had never thought to disable because he had never thought his mother would know it was there. Norman's tear-streaked face. His wail. I swapped them. The red pills for the sugar ones. The footage was clean, well lit by the corridor lights spilling through the open door, the audio crisp from the bunker's sealed acoustics. The archival server, Norman's own ghost theater apparatus, the hardware he'd used to broadcast my dead husband's stolen voice, was now transmitting the confession of his son on every screen in the house he'd tried to steal. He had built the stage. I had changed the production. Norman looked up from the floor, his face wet and bewildered, and saw himself on the screen in the corridor, and the sound he made was not language. I found the final icon on the haptic grid by memory, the 7th position on the 3rd row, a raised pattern I had memorized as the shape of an open hand. The red hand. Not the local police. The judge had been explicit about this distinction, in the way he was explicit about everything that mattered: local law enforcement, however well-intentioned, could be confused by wealth, by social architecture, by the particular fog that a man like Norman Walker could generate around himself in a community where his family name carried weight. The red hand was a direct, encrypted alert to the Federal Judicial Security Task Force, the tactical unit the judge had worked with throughout his final decade on the bench, the men who had been briefed on the Walker estate's layout, who had responded to 3 separate threat assessments over the years, who knew this house and knew the judge's protocols and would not be slowed by the performance of a socialite with a lawyer. Somewhere 6 miles from the Walker estate, in a tactical command center I had visited exactly once in 2018, a silent alarm was currently screaming with a GPS tag attached. I pressed my palm flat against the haptic grid and felt the house breathe its confirmation back into my skin. The clock had run out. Bradley Vance moved for the door. The expensive loafers skidded on the concrete, the sound of a man whose body has made a decision slightly ahead of his dignity, and he grabbed the door frame with both hands, his folder dropping, the fountain pen clattering against the floor. "I'm out," he shouted, and the voice had lost every trace of the smooth baritone. "This is your mess, Norman. This is entirely your mess." I flicked my finger across the 3rd row of the grid. The estate locked down. The sound of it traveled through the foundation like thunder, not one impact but a sequence of them, the heavy, mechanical thud of reinforced steel shutters engaging across every window and door in the mansion, the specific percussion of a house that has converted from residence to fortress. I heard the wrought iron gates at the end of the driveway, a long, hydraulic hiss and then the resonant clang of the latch engaging, transmitted through 200 feet of stone driveway and brick wall and foundation concrete to the bunker floor beneath my feet. Bradley pulled at the bunker door. The electromagnetic locks had engaged 30 seconds ago. The door did not move. He pulled again, his fingers scrabbling at the frame with the frantic, undignified energy of a man whose professional composure has been completely evacuated by circumstance, and the door remained precisely where it was. He was trapped in the tomb he had helped design. I said nothing. There was nothing useful to say. I held the bear and I stood in the alcove with my back against the wall and I waited with the patience of a woman who has been waiting, in various forms, for a very long time. The minutes that followed had their own quality, dense, compressed, Norman's sobbing filling the soundproof room with a sound that had stopped being performance and become simply the noise a broken thing makes, and Bradley's cursing cycling through registers of fury and desperation and something that was beginning to sound like genuine fear. I did not watch them. I watched the corridor. The light changed first, a flicker at the top of the basement stairs, rhythmic and colored, the unmistakable strobing pulse of red and blue that has meant, for my entire adult life, the arrival of authority with iron in its hands. The ground began to vibrate, a series of heavy, disciplined impacts traveling through the marble of the foyer above, the particular cadence of tactical boots moving in coordinated formation, the sound of professionals who have done this before and will do it correctly. A hydraulic ram against the front doors, a single, definitive impact that I felt in my teeth, and then the sound of the breach. The Walker estate had been designed by my husband to be many things, a home, a workspace, a sanctuary, a fortress. In this moment, standing in the basement with Norman Walker collapsed on the floor and Bradley Vance pressed against an electromagnetic door he could not open, I felt the house fulfill the purpose the judge had always, in his deepest architectural paranoia, intended for it. A courtroom. The bunker door blew off its magnetic hinges with a controlled charge. The sound was sharp and contained, a professional detonation, minimal collateral, the work of people who had been trained to open rooms without destroying them. Smoke curled through the opening in thin, chemical wisps, and then the weapon lights came, 3 of them, cutting through the smoke in precise, coordinated angles, the laser-focused illumination of a SWAT entry team that has been briefed on the layout and is moving with the efficiency of people who are not improvising. The light hit me. I stood up straight. I am 5 feet 5 inches tall, lean and silver-haired, wearing a cashmere cardigan with a missing button and a silk blouse stained with the chemical residue of my son's theatrical prop. I am 68 years old and I have not slept and I cannot see clearly and my thumb is still swollen from the safe door and my throat is raw from screaming into a hurricane, and I smoothed my hair with one hand and adjusted my husband's watch on my wrist, and I walked out of the alcove with my spine precisely vertical. I crossed the bunker floor to where Norman sat, collapsed against the wall, Buddy's absence apparently registering even through the days of scotch and confession, his knees drawn up and his face in his hands, and the sounds coming from behind his fingers, the sounds of a man who has arrived at the end of his own narrative and found it ending badly. I stood over him for a moment. Then I crouched, slowly, my knees making their opinion known, and I placed the bear in his lap. I set it there with the same deliberate care I use when I set something valuable on a shelf, because the gesture required precision, required the absence of contempt, required the specific quality of finality that a verdict carries when it is delivered not with anger but with the exhausted, clear-eyed certainty of a judgment that has been earned. "Your only friend heard everything, Norman," I said. My voice was quiet and even, and it did not tremble. And so did the authorities. I stood up. I walked past the SWAT team, past the weapon lights and the tactical gear and the controlled, professional organized chaos of a federal entry, and I did not look back. My head was level. My steps were measured. I counted them out of the habit of a woman who navigates best when she knows exactly where she is. I walked up 17 stairs and into the light. Morning came to Atlanta the way it sometimes does after a long night of rain, tentative at first, then suddenly and completely itself, the sky clearing from gray to a pale, transparent blue that makes the air feel like the first breath after a very long-held one. I stood on the veranda. The federal agents moved through the house below and behind me with the methodical efficiency of people with warrants and evidence bags and the specific, quiet authority of institutions that have been waiting a long time for a case to break open. I could hear them, the low exchange of professional voices, the careful sounds of things being documented, the occasional creak of floorboards under boots that moved with purpose rather than weight. The chemical vial went into an evidence bag. I watched a technician carry it past the veranda door in gloved hands, the small glass container that Norman had pressed under my nose with such theatrical cruelty, reduced now to a labeled exhibit. The tattered bear followed, sealed in clear plastic by an agent who handled it with the same careful neutrality he would give to any piece of evidence, which is to say without sentiment, which is exactly the correct approach. Trash, finally, in its proper place. I raised my wrist and looked at the watch. The crystal was intact. The movement was running. I could feel the faint, precise vibration through the gold of the case, the heartbeat of a mechanism built to last longer than any of the people who would ever wear it. My husband had bought it the year he was elevated to the federal bench, and he had worn it for 30 years. And I had worn it for 14 months, and it had been ticking steadily through all of it, through the safe door and the chemical vial and the darkness and the confession and the breach, indifferent to the drama of human beings, marking time with the quiet authority of a thing that knows its single purpose and performs it without interruption. The air smelled of rain and pine and the particular, clean quality of Atlanta after a storm has moved through, not the manufactured rot of Norman's theater, not the chemical signature of his compound, but actual air. The real thing, moving freely through my sinuses and confirming, with each breath, that my body was functioning and the house was mine and the morning was beginning. Mr. Elliot would need to be called. There was much to explain, and some of it would be painful, and I would not spare him the facts simply because the facts were difficult. He deserved to know what he had walked away from, and why, and what the paperwork he'd been shown actually represented. He was a good man who had been deceived by a skilled performance, and good men who have been deceived deserve the truth delivered without softening. There was the judge's cardiologist to contact, the medical examiner, the county clerk, the judge's case files to be reviewed, in light of what I now knew, for any cases that Norman might have attempted to influence. There was the Walker Justice Initiative, the real papers, the ones I had prepared and maintained through 14 months of grief and one night of bunker darkness, waiting for my signature. There was work. There was, as there always is when justice has been served and the room has been cleared, a great deal of work remaining. I touched the watch face. A single, deliberate circuit of the crystal. Tomorrow, I sign the papers for the Walker Justice Initiative. I had promised myself that once, in the dark, as a fixed point to navigate toward, a true north to keep the count honest when everything else was trying to disorient me. The foundation for the wrongfully accused. The institution that would carry the judge's name and the judge's purpose forward into whatever years remained to me for carrying things. I am not the shadow behind the judge. I was never only that, though I permitted the world to see me that way when it served my purposes and the purposes of the work we shared. A shadow requires a source of light and a surface to fall on and a particular angle of incidence. It is a consequence of conditions, a dependent thing. I am not dependent on conditions. I looked out at the driveway where Bradley Vance was being escorted to a federal vehicle, his expensive suit still impeccable, his face wearing the careful blankness of a man who has decided his next words will be addressed to his attorney and no one else. I looked at the lawn where the rain-soaked pine needles lay in their clean, geometric patterns, pressed flat by the storm, already beginning to lift as the morning air moved through them. The judge used to say the law is a shadow and justice is the light. I said it back to him for 40 years, and I believed it, and I still believe it, but I understand it differently now than I did on the morning I first heard it. Justice is not passive. It does not shine on its own. It requires someone to carry it through the dark, to keep it burning through soundproof concrete and manufactured rot and the gaslighting whisper of a son who believes his mother's mind is a thing he can simply take. I am 68 years old. I am the verdict. If you made it to this moment, thank you for listening all the way through. Most people bail before the bill comes due. But here, the bill always comes due. What started as humiliation and disrespect ended with receipts, truth, and a payoff they never saw coming. If you want more stories where karma shows up without mercy, hit subscribe and come back for the next one. Now tell me in the comments, what was the most disgusting thing they did? What crossed the line for you?